Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. Today is so-called Blue Monday, but to shine some light on it, I'm delighted this evening to introduce much-loved writer and illustrator Debbie Gliori. Debbie is best known for her many picture books for children, including the much-loved No Matter What, Stormy Weather, What's the Time, Mr. Wolf, and The Trouble with Dragons. But this evening, the title of Debbie's talk is Signals from the Abyss, Navigating Depression, focusing on her book Night Shift. Debbie and I will be sharing personal insight into a subject that affects large numbers of us, yet is rarely discussed, and that, of course, is depression. Whilst there are currently no cure for the condition, Debbie is going to talk about her own experience of depression, share some strategies for finding your own way through the fog, and hopefully inspire and support those impacted. So without further ado, over to you, Debbie.
Hi there. Can I just say that for everybody who has tuned in tonight or in the future, having a look at this webinar online, what you have just done by joining us is an act of self-care. And these are the things that we probably need to focus on, especially now in the middle of the situation that we all find ourselves in, this current lockdown, global pandemic, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief history of what happened to me and my sort of experience of living with depression, and then I'm going to share some of the images from my book, which is a very short book called Night Shift. It's a short and small book, there we go, which I wrote and illustrated a few years ago after more or less a lifetime of sort of dipping in and out of various episodes of depression. But the one that I want to focus on, of the many episodes that I've sort of been through, is the very, very first one, because I had had no experience or understanding of what it was to be depressed. I hadn't a clue what had hit me. So perhaps to understand how I got there, let's begin at the beginning. Bear with me. I was a sort of quite a lonely child. I was an only child of two elderly, compared to my friends, parents. And I think I was quite a sort of, fairly happy child who read a great deal and was quite self-sufficient. And yeah, I sort of lived in a little dream world, as quite a lot of fortunate children do. And my parents were at that point really sort of wallpaper, because that's probably what you need most from your parents, is that they are there, they are supportive, they do all the needful, but they don't actually make huge demands or step up centre stage and start sort of hogging all the limelight, as it were. That sounds very harsh. Anyway, so I was sort of happily having a childhood when it was interrupted by my parents deciding that they couldn't stand the sight of each other anymore and having a long and very acrimonious split up. And from then on, I ended up living with my mum in a succession of boarding houses in Glasgow. And my this was in a time in the 1960s when people just didn't do that, especially not sort of Catholic families, which was the kind of family that I came from back then. So my mum, I think, felt herself to be something of a pariah because she had nobody else that she could actually share her experience of separation, divorce, single parenthood, etc. with. So she sort of shared it with me, and I was aware that she was not happy. She possibly overshared, but who can blame her for that? But all I can really remember of those years from about the age of 6 to when I was 14 was just a sort of general low level unhappiness at home. You know, my mum did her absolute best to sort of raise me herself, but you know, I couldn't escape the fact that here was a woman who was not a happy bunny at all. Anyway, we got on with it. I, you know, sort of did what I had to do at school, had a few friends, had a reasonably sheltered life. And then one day, I would see my dad every Saturday. He would come for sort of what was then called an access visit, and he would come for 2 hours, and we would sit in the kitchen. And at the end of his visit, my mum would question question me, like the sort of Spanish Inquisition. What did he say? What did you say? Then what did he say? Then what did you say? So there was always this feeling when I was with my dad that I was going to have to answer to my mum afterwards, and you know, sort of detail the exact conversations that my dad and I had. But one day he pitched up in the middle of the day, which was kind of unheard of, and he said, "I've got something to tell you both." And he told us that he had a second family, that he had a new partner, and that his new partner had given birth. And my mum threw her hands up in the air and burst into tears and was desperately upset. And I was fairly unmoved. And the reason I was fairly unmoved was that a few months previously I'd been away at a camp for sort of children who played musical instruments. Glasgow schools used to do this summer camp, 2 weeks of intensive sort of music playing, at the end of which you gave a concert for your parents. And my dad had come to visit me there because I was very, very homesick while I was there. And my mum, for once, had phoned him and said, you know, could you go and see Deborah because she's having a hard time. So dad had pitched up. After which, it was great. You know, I sort of saw him for a couple of hours and he went away, and I felt much cheered at, you know, having a sort of parent turn up to see me. And one of my fellow young musicians said to me, "Is that your dad?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "You never said you'd a baby in your house." And I said, "You what? We don't have a baby in our house." And she said, "Yeah, you do." She said, "I saw your dad and mum in the hospital." She said, "My mum's a midwife and I'd gone in, you know, sort of meet her mum at work, and there was your dad and your mum and your new baby brother." And I sort of thought, oh, and I put it together in my head and I thought, oh my goodness. And it was like dropping a boulder into a still pool. You know, the ripples spread right out. And I thought, what do I do with this? Who can I share this with? Who on earth can I tell? I can't tell my mum because she'll completely lose the plot. And I can't discuss it with my dad because I knew my dad well enough to know that he would explode, because he was, I think, quite an angry person. So I had to sit on this. I had to keep a lid on it. So consequently, when my dad dropped the bombshell on my mum and I, my mum was upset and I wasn't. And my mum, after my dad left, said, "Why aren't you upset? What's wrong with you?" And I couldn't say to her, "Well, actually, you know, I knew about all of this." So I had to just say, "Well, I don't really feel anything." So my mum, determined to make me feel something, said, "Well, he won't love you anymore. You'll be second fiddle. You know, he'll love the new baby more." And it was, she was trying to get a reaction out of me. So on we went, and I met the new baby, and I met the new baby's mother. And every so often, my dad would come for a sort of Saturday evening visit for 2 hours. My mum would still ask me all the questions afterwards. And finally, throw into that toxic mix, puberty, and I just thought, do you know what? I've had enough. I've had enough of the grown-ups in my life behaving badly. Everybody is behaving badly. So I didn't deliberately do what I did. I reacted, and my reaction was to find myself a boyfriend who was twice as old as me. So I was 15, he was 30, and you know, it doesn't take a major sort of psychiatrist to work out what was going on there. And over a period of a couple of months, I decided that, you know, he was just absolutely the cat's pajamas. He was way better than my parents, and that I wanted to spend my entire life with him. So understandably, my parents were not impressed. In fact, they completely and totally overreacted. They put out a restraining order on the boyfriend, and my mother more or less locked me in the house. And she would go out to work and she would turn the key on the door. She would put the phone in a locked cupboard so I couldn't phone out, and she'd lock me in the flat. And at the time, we were living in a fourth floor flat in Glasgow. So there I was, stuck inside. My friends from school would come and stand down on the pavement and yell up at me. And I couldn't even yell down to them because we had, appalling double glazing that you couldn't actually open. It was sort of, stuck to the windows and hampered any attempts, to open the window and shout down. So after a few months of this, I thought enough of this, and I basically started behaving very badly, turning up late, never coming in at night, just sort of being a very, very rebellious teen. And finally, my mother got a social worker involved, and the social worker said, you know what, I think the best thing you can do is let Deborah go. Let her go. Stop trying to, sort of imprison her in the house. So as he said that, I was running into the bedroom to pack my bags. It was like, well, hey, I'm out of here. So I left and I went to live with my boyfriend in a hovel in Glasgow. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it was a hovel. It was a pit. And I very, very stupidly, I'm looking back at myself, I'm now 61 and I'm looking back at my sort of 16-year-old self and thinking, oh my goodness, what a twit you were. I experimented with just about every single drug going, but had a particular fondness for cannabis. And, I became quite expert at rolling joints and smoking them and managing not to fall over. And I thought myself quite the queen of cool. And then boyfriend, who was actually a very deeply unpleasant person, ended up going to prison, and I was left on my own in a flat in Glasgow. And things started to unravel quite quickly. And the first thing that went really desperately wrong was I woke up one morning and I'd had a friend over, and he'd ended up spending the night. And this is a completely just a friend. So he was sleeping in one corner of the room, I was sleeping in the other, and my door got knocked down, and several officers from Glasgow's drug squad came barreling into the house, or the room rather, and said, right, where'd you keep it? And I said, keep what? And they said, we know you've got some. And they started to turn the room upside down. Well, there wasn't very much in the room to turn upside down, and my housekeeping skills to this day are not of the finest. And within about 5 minutes, they found floating in the sort of dregs inside a can of beer, they found two roaches, and they went, aha, we've got you now. And off they went, putting the roaches in a plastic bag, and they said, you'll be hearing from us. And lo and behold, I did. Some months on, I was called up to court for the first time along with my friend who'd been staying the night, and he stood up there and said, yeah, I'm sorry, Your Honour, it was my hash, and, it's my fault, and yeah, guilty. And he got a fine. I stood up and I said, I think cannabis should be legalised. I really think, you're making a terrible mistake. And I mean, what an idiot I was, but I didn't know any better. And so the sheriff said, we've got a live one here. What we'll do is we'll have another little session in court some months down the line, and we'll work out what to do with you. So off I went on my merry way, and didn't really think about it. And come one dark January day, back I went to court. But by then I'd grown a few brain cells, so I was actually not dressed in a long skirt down to the ground, bare feet. I was actually wearing a suit, and I got myself hired at Laura Ashley, so I had a job, and I just moved into a nice flat, and I was about to get rid of the horrible boyfriend, and things were beginning to look up. But my mum was in the court, and before I could open my mouth to say, yes, I plead guilty, yes, I'm an idiot, no, I don't think cannabis should be legal, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, please can I have a fine and go home? My mum ran up to the front of the court and said, you have to do something, my daughter has fallen in with terrible people, and, she's in danger, and blah, blah, blah. And the sheriff said, right, okay. I need to think about this. So while I think about this, you, meaning me, can go to prison. And I was, what? What? No, but I've got a job and I'm wearing a suit and I've got a nice flat and before I knew it, off I was going in a little black van to Greenock Women's Prison, which back then was a very old-fashioned and really unpleasant prison. So all of that was just as you would expect, pretty horrible, massive shock. And as soon as I got out of prison, I was sort of sent into the care of my parents, my mother particularly. And within 3 weeks of going back to live at home with my mum locking me up and all of that, I thought I cannot take this. So I ran away. I ran away with horrible boyfriend because I couldn't think of what else to do. And we ended up being on the run. We didn't run very far. We ran to Fife. We stayed in a squat, which was hideous. And within a couple of months, I discovered I was pregnant and I was overjoyed. I was so happy to have a little baby of my own. So, to very quickly move on, I eventually saw the error of my ways and got rid of, well, I didn't get rid of my baby's father. He managed to get rid of himself by going to prison yet again. He went in and out of prison all the time. He was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. And I was left with this little tiny 4-month-old baby. And my mother hove back into view and she said, Deborah, you need to do something with your life. You can't just hang around at home with a baby. And I was really actually quite happy hanging out with my little baby. He was delightful. I understood what he needed. And, you know, I was completely and utterly besotted with him in the way that parents are. And I didn't actually want to do anything with my life, but thank goodness my mum gave me a prod because I ended up thinking, right, okay, if I have to do something, I'd like to go to art college. And I'd like to say the rest was history. It more or less was. I did get into art college. I had a brilliant time. I loved it to bits. Um, and meanwhile, my little boy was growing up. And by the time he was 9, I was beginning to establish myself as an illustrator. And things had turned round. I was in a really nice relationship with a lovely man. I was living in a sweet country cottage. And suddenly, really out of nowhere, I started getting this feeling of impending doom. I could not work out where it was coming from, but I sort of, I knew that something awful was about to happen. I'd wake up every morning thinking, "Oh my God, what is it?" And little by little and bit by bit, I started to become unglued. I stopped sleeping properly and I stayed up really late working because I had quite a lot of freelance work as an illustrator. And I began to really trash my sleep patterns. And if you do that to any human being, um, they will, if you take away sleep, they will eventually enter a psychotic state. And that is more or less what happened to me. I started hearing voices, hallucinating, being utterly convinced that something, you know, there's something dreadful, whatever it was actually happening. And nobody else in the world was aware of it. And pretty rapidly, my partner and my mum as well decided that what I needed was psychiatric help. So they got me in front of a psychiatrist at the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, and the psychiatrist literally said to me, and I mean, I can remember this so clearly, count backwards from 107s. So I did that, thinking, why am I doing this? And then he said, who's the PM? And I said, Thatcher, because it wasn't the Thatcher years. And he turned to my mother. I mean, he'd made his diagnosis and he just said, yeah, manic depressive. She needs to go to her doctor. Of end of that. So there was no help forthcoming. So off I went to my GP and I said, well, I've just been to the Royal Ed and they said, and he asked me a lot more questions and laughed merrily and said, oh, we'll have you right as rain in no time. Here, take these. And wrote me a prescription for an antidepressant called amitriptyline. And the prescription was so massive that I swear it would have felled a horse. So I went from this sort of anxious, terrified, sleep deprived, semi-psychotic person who was, you know, sort of connecting up everything and making no sense whatsoever, into a zombie almost overnight. The drugs worked so well that they took me right down off that high peak and then down into the pits. And for the next 9 months, I really couldn't do anything. I couldn't string a sentence together. I couldn't read a book. I couldn't paint a picture. I could barely look after my child. And it was just horrific. I felt like one minute I'd had a life and the next minute it was gone. And I believed during that period I would never, ever be me ever again. And it was utterly terrifying. And it was the bleakest period of my life, bar none. And this is a woman who had been to prison and had very strange upbringing and had an abusive husband and blah, blah, blah. But those 9 months of taking this antidepressant and just staggering through the days, that was dreadful. And I will do absolutely anything in my power to avoid ever going back to that place again, because nobody wants to be there. So obviously I'm not there now. Um, I have gone back close to it. I have circled close to it because unfortunately the nature of depressive illness for some people, myself included, means that once is not enough. It comes back. And what I have learned to do is to recognize it. And what I've also learned to do is work through a whole bunch of coping strategies or accommodations, because it's not really like I'm coping, because that that has a sort of, that smacks of stiff upper lipness, and I'm not a stiff upper lipness type person. I am a complete and total wuss. I really am. A nice wuss, but a wuss nonetheless. What I've discovered are just ways of accommodating depression to allow it to be there, but not to actually define me. And to understand deep within myself, even if I'm right in the middle of a depressive period in my life, to understand that this will pass. Depression tells you it won't. Depression lies like a bandit, but it does pass. Everything changes. Even that. You are not, should you be unfortunate enough to be in the middle of a depressive episode, you are not going to be in it for the rest of your life. Anyway, it took me 40 years? No, 35 years to process that first episode of depression. But at the end of it, what came out was a book. And I didn't mean it to be a book. The images that you're about to see, actually, I started drawing them because I was in the middle of sort of circling the drain and being aware that I was heading into another depressive episode. And what I wanted to do was explain to my lovely family that how it felt, because words seem to desert you when you're deep in the pit. And all I was trying to do was get a signal out to say, I'm still here, but this is what I feel like. And I did a series of drawings, and my agent in London, my artist agent, asked me one day, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, I've done these drawings because, I've been going through, a sort of yet another sort of depressive episode, and I just, I was drawing it." And she said, "Let me see." So I showed her, and she said, "Oh my God, it's a book," because agents, bless them, can monetize just about anything. And I am so grateful to her for seeing that it was a book. All I saw at the time was my feelings writ large in charcoal. The actual drawings that are in this book are probably about 1.5 meters tall and a meter wide. They're the biggest drawings I've ever done in my life. And it was, yes, cathartic drawing them, because I normally, for my children's books, it's very douce and ladylike, and I paint with watercolors. But with these, for these drawings, which were kind of being wrenched out of my, my core, I used charcoal, which was a medium I knew nothing about. It's messy, it's dirty, but oh my goodness, it gets the job done, and it gets it done really well. Anyway, enough of this. Let me show you some drawings, and I'll hang on. I cannot talk and do this. I have to do, there we go. Okie doke. So this is the first drawing. This wasn't in the book. You'll know when the book starts. This is the sort of idea of happiness. This is what, children's illustrators and mummies of 5 children are supposed to be like. We're supposed to be really happy and bouncy. In actual fact, this is closer to the truth. This is me with my welder's helmet on, offering a Madeleine to a dragon. But it's a baby dragon, that's why it's got a bib, one of those bibs on. I will explain more about this later. This is actually really an illustration for a quote from Proust, which sounds very grand, but it was, it was what I needed to draw at the time, and it makes sense. Anyway, so along with depression usually goes a good going dose of anxiety. And this is a little character from one of my books called The Scariest Thing of All, and he is writing his list of all the things that he is scared of. And, I can be drawing this stuff and I'll suddenly go, oh, wait a minute, that's me. And I sort of, when I look back through my books, I realise that they're almost like diaries of my mental state. So this to me is what anxiety feels like, a long, long list of things that you're scared of, an enormous list, from conkers to earwigs to spiders. And towards the end of that book, the little rabbit, having been through a big dark wood, because no children's narrative is complete without a big dark wood, he gets to a point where he encounters this thing called the scariest thing of all, which is basically a collapsed tree root. And he looks at it and he's absolutely terrified, and he hears this terrible rumbling noise. And then he realizes the terrible rumbling noise is not the scariest thing of all. It's actually his tummy, because he's missed his tea time. And there he is by the side of the pool. And he's put it all together and he's realized that the thing he is most scared of is himself. And that is a truism. The things we can pull out of our own mind are probably scarier than anything else in existence. And sometimes this is what it feels like. Anxiety and depression can make you feel like you're caught in headlights, that you're a tiny little creature and that you have no power against the darkness. Well, that is one of the many lies that depression tells. You have the power. The darkness can be pressed back. So, Night Shift. And that's the cover of the hardback. This is the cover of the paperback. I don't know when it began. Perhaps it drifted in at night like fog. I felt tired all day long. The fog rolled in every night, and during the day too. Mornings felt full of dread, heart hammering, stomach churning. I felt hollowed out. Night after night, I was diminished. I woke up every night, afraid of something I couldn't see. And one night, I didn't know who I was anymore. I got up, looked in the mirror, and I saw that I was ill. Words left me. There was no language for this feeling. Lacking words, I tried to draw a map to help me find something I couldn't name. But I had lost my compass, and without it, any map was forfeit. Chin up. If at first you don't succeed, try. Try again. pull yourself together. Get a grip. Think of the starving millions. It is better to light a candle than curse the darkness. Night skills. The ability to survive inside my own darkness. Night skills. Sometimes the teacher uses the harshest methods to hammer the message home. Night skills. Holding fast to nothing in the knowledge that nothing will last forever. And one day I dragged myself out to run, with the dragons not far behind, reminding me that this was pointless, that I couldn't possibly outrun them, and that I was too weak to even think about trying. And then this happened. I couldn't run anymore, out of breath. The dragons were right. I was weak. I dragged myself up on top of a sand dune, and there, lying in the grass, was a feather, black and white, stripy and beautiful, neither black nor all white. And something shifted. And you can see the dragons that were following her, besetting her, are actually seabirds. And this ending to the book came about because a friend of mine, a counsellor, we were on a hill walk together, and I said to her, so how do you get your clients to, how do you get them through an episode of depression? And she said, I get them to reframe their narrative. And by that she meant, you can't change the past. You can't make it different. The past is the past. What it did is what it did. But what you can do is change your perception of it. You can change how you frame it. The past is the narrative of your life, but you can reframe that narrative. So she's not denying that there were dragons, but she is now seeing them as seabirds. I guess it's an allegory. And there they are. I did go running. I have to say I'm the world's most inadequate runner, and these days I can't even run. I have to do scouts running, that thing where you run for a count of however many seconds, and then you walk for the same, and you run and walk. But it does the job. It really does. So here we have a character, the small girl, feeding her dragon a Madeleine. And the Madeleine is that Proustian thing of memory. When Proust, when his character in La Recherche de Temps Perdu ate a Madeleine, it transported him back. The taste, the smell was the sort of essence of memory. And there's this lovely quote from that book, and I'm probably going to mangle it. Yeah, Proust said, ideas come to us as the successors to grief, and griefs, at the moment they change into ideas, lose some of their power to injure the heart. And that is so very true. And sometimes this is what it feels like you're in a bubble, and beyond the bubble is all the colour and life in the world, but there you are, stuck inside your frozen bubble. But in that darkness and in that frozenness, if you can find even the tiniest feather, the tiniest spark of light, the tiniest crack, like the late great Leonard Cohen said, everything has a crack in it. That's how the light gets in. and it could be a feather. For a long time after I wrote Night Shift, I seemed to be just sort of fated to find feathers absolutely everywhere. But some of the other things that you can do to mitigate the awful, to make yourself feel better, are if you can still read, then reading is always helpful, because in reading a book, you're stepping into somebody else's shoes. A simple thing like making yourself soup, possibly not juggling the ingredients, but making soup for yourself is an act of self-care. And that's the first thing that you really do need to do, is to realize that you need to befriend yourself. Because part of the depressive package is this very negative self-talk that goes on in your head, the voice of depression that tells you you are, worthless and nobody cares. That is another of the great lies that depression tells us. And trying to sort of stop that voice from taking over and replace it with a voice that says you are beloved. You are a child of the universe. You are worthy of love. And you know the sign, oh my goodness, remember when we used to fly in airplanes before the pandemic, and there was always the instructions for what to do if the plane is going down, and the first thing is put on your own seatbelt and life jacket before helping others. You have to look after yourself first. So making soup is one way of doing so. Going out for walks regularly, every single day, even when you don't feel like it. And my goodness, it's hard in January. It's hard all year round to force yourself outside. But as you know, once you're out, it invariably feels better inside your head. And sometimes you might want to stay out for longer. And what you notice if you do this every single day is the seasons changing around you. And that, in a way, reduces the grey fog. Outside in all weathers, even when it's foul, and my goodness, Scotland can do foul like no other country, but there is something quite magnificent in being out there as it throws it down out the sky, even if it's only a contrast. If you sit inside and it's just grey fog, but if you go out, it means that when you go back in, it's better. It's better than being outside. There is a contrast, and contrast is all in the grey fog. Unplugging from your devices. I understand that social media is a way of keeping in touch with people. I mean, I use it myself, but I know that it is also, in overuse, can be completely toxic. So at times it is good to unplug, especially, oh my goodness, I can't stress this enough, before bedtime. Put the screens away, do something that lulls you, that helps you get a good night's sleep, whether it is reading or playing board games or knitting or doing some craft activity that just doesn't wake you up too much. But screens, blah, not before bedtime. And actually helping other people. Every single day, if you do one good thing for another person, even if it's going onto social media and complimenting somebody on the wittiness of their tweet, or the sort of beauty of the photograph they've just shared, or any little tiny act of kindness to each other, improves the sum of human happiness. So I asked various people, friends and colleagues on social media, what they do to beat back the darkness in this particular time, and I got a whole raft of coping strategies, some of which were downright weird. One of my dearest friends said, "Oh, I decided to master Photoshop," and I thought, well, that's too hard. But people said their pets really helped, gardening helps, long walks, jigsaw puzzles, a good book. A friend of mine said felting, needle felting, because of the stabby, 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 stabby. That helps relieve your finer feelings. Trying a new recipe, cooking things that involve lots of chopping. spinning wool, eating chocolate, walking dogs, essential oils in your bath, long baths, listening to classical music, weeding, listening to audiobooks, getting regular sleep if you can, and keeping a diary or a journal, because that way you can look back and you can see how you have changed and how things have got better. I find 10-minute meditation every morning is, it works for me. It calms me down. All of these things are acts of self-care, and that is what is needed right now. Be good to yourself. You are very much worth it.